40% of adults in just the U.S. require corrective vision or vision correction, and more than 40% consider LASIK surgery but are either ineligible or afraid of eye surgery. Currently, there are some 700,000 LASIK surgeries a year done in the U.S., representing only 2% of eligible patients. And Mike Totterman's Clerio Vision, his company, has plans for many of us who need or want better vision without surgery. And if you could see the font on my notes here, it's very, very large.
Me too.
Because I forgot my glasses in the car. So Mike, thank you so much for talking with us today. Tell us a little bit more about what Clerio's doing. It's refractive vision correction, but it's non-invasive.
Yeah, so it's actually quite interesting. So just a little bit of backdrop on the company. So technology developed at the University of Rochester. Ophthalmology has been a big area for this region for a long time with B&L and a lot of the other companies. So we got very lucky with the fact that there was a large patent portfolio that was available from the U of R. About 55 issued and pending patents that we're currently commercializing. So one of the largest portfolios I've actually ever seen, a global portfolio. So what the project, when B&L was undertaking it and now we're carrying forward, was really focused on kind of the holy grail in vision correction, which is how could you correct directly in the cornea of your vision without any cutting or ablating or removing corneal tissue.
Which is what LASIK does.
Which is exactly what LASIK does. So it's actually a really good point. So LASIK, I'm sure some of you have had it, so it's a 2-laser procedure. The first laser cuts open the cornea, so you have to peel it open, which is, when you see the videos, you're like, okay, I'm not sure I want to do that. and the second laser, which is even more interesting, is it removes tissue, and there's a little bit of smoke coming out of your eye. There's a little vacuum that vacuums it up. But it's a fairly safe procedure. It does have some complications, but most of the folks, because now there's a lot more disclosure around LASIK, so when you watch the video, you're like, okay, that looks interesting, but maybe for somebody else, especially given that you have to be awake to do the procedure. So a lot of the desire in the community has been, hey, okay, could we do something with a laser, but in a way where, I lie down, the laser goes choo-choo-choo-choo, but there's no cutting and no ablation. That's really kind of the technology that we're focused on commercializing.
And it was started here at the U of R.
Yeah, it was really interesting. A lot of folks are, kind of upset about the fact that B&L got acquired, so I think this is one of those things that may have been a kind of a silver lining out of it. So the project started almost 10 years ago. Bausch & Lomb sponsored it at the U of R, multiple different academic institutions at the U of R. So Flower Institute, they've got specialty in vision correction, traditional LASIK, the Institute of Optics, which obviously has all the lenses, lasers, everything else, and then another engineering department that does a lot of the micromotors for our systems. So several $1 million went into the project, and we saw it as a unique opportunity. Once Valiant decided not to commercialize it, came back to the U of R, and we said, hey, this is just too good of a technology not to found a startup around.
But this is not your first startup, right, Mike?
No, I've made a lot of mistakes along the way.
Much to our profit, because you're going to tell us about those so that we don't make them. So you actually got your start in venture capitalism, which really works in well with what you're doing.
I did, and that allowed me to paper over some of the mistakes. So my original background was really engineering, and then I went to consulting and venture capital in Silicon Valley. So what I learned was how to make a nice PowerPoint presentation so people write you checks. But I had no idea how to run a company. But money can cover for a lot of mistakes. So the first startup, I think the thing that we did well, we raised a lot of money. We bought fancy furniture and beautiful business cards and all kind of things that we shouldn't have spent money on. So one of the lessons from early on is just you really should focus most of your resources on the product. Product, market, consumer. So nowadays what we do is kind of the opposite of it. And I learned that from one of my co-founders, Alex, over there. So I'll embarrass him with the story. So
who's very often in this seat.
Yeah, quite often they interview us, so.
Mistakes are cool for entrepreneurs.
Yeah. So instead of the first one, we bought Aeron chairs, which back in the kind of .com era were these $1,000 chairs, which were.
That's going to get somebody to buy your product, right?
Yeah, has no relation to buying the product. So nowadays, on the first day in the office, you have 2 boxes. You have the box that your parts for your chair come in, and then you have the box that the parts for your table come in, and
You use those as your desk and
we
your
use
chair.
those.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Well, not quite. They're actually parts in those things. So the first day is spent assembling your chair and assembling your desk, which I think Jamie over there can attest to. So we're continuing that legacy that Alex taught us early on. And I think the bigger point with that is not so much that we really should necessarily be assembling our own chairs and desks, but I think it collectively teaches for us that you want to be as frugal as possible, because you'll always need money for that mistake that you end up making. So if you didn't spend it, if your chair cost like $25 and you assembled it and you saved $1,000 on an Aeron chair, now if your laptop breaks and you need to buy a new laptop, you've got that extra $975.
But it's really interesting because you left venture capitalism to go and help your mom, who really got you
Yes.
into this whole business with her company, Virtualscopics.
I did, and it was supposed to be a short-term 6-month gig. I was like, okay, Rochester, I'll leave Silicon Valley, I'll come here for 6 months, I'll kind of get it on its feet and go back. And I actually did not have any background before in the medical space. Mine had been software, routers, networking, wireless. So it was a pretty steep learning curve, but given that was my mother, I could say, okay, well, what's this part of the knee and what's that part of the cartilage? So
Sorry, Mom.
Yeah, sorry, Mom. I didn't pay enough attention in school in my biology class. But where I kind of added the element to it is I said, okay, I know how to work with the venture capital firms. I know how to put together a pitch and a financial model so we can raise the money. And along the way, I really did fall very much in love with entrepreneurship. I realized that this is, for me personally, a lot more enjoyable than doing venture capital. Venture capital obviously is super important. Without it, it's often impossible to build these businesses that require a lot of capital. But there, you're not kind of in the trenches working on getting the product done. So in entrepreneurship, it's that one of those unique things where before there was nothing, and then there's a group of people, and then something comes out of it. So there's that process of creation. So
And everyone's so important in that beginning.
everybody
Everybody has their purpose.
Everybody's critical. The other thing, kind of along the lines of what you said, lessons, is what we try to do is when we bring team members on board is originally at Virtualscopics, we hired more for like, okay, well, we want to get the best person in, let's say, software, but software alone. Now we try to get folks who are a little bit more well-rounded. So they may have done software, but they may have done some operations, they may have had some HR experience, because you never know what's going to change, and you hate firing people. That's like probably the worst thing that you have to go through in entrepreneurship. So if you hire folks who've got multiple different hats that they can wear, so then you can much more easily shift around.
Shift around. So you were doing Virtualscopics with your mother,
Yes.
which is a very successful company. But you went back out west and went back to venture capitalism, and then
I got bored.
it really is, you're addicted, right?
It is, and I think for folks in the audience, I'm sure the same thing is if you've done entrepreneurship, it is something that's quite different from a lot of other things. So you really kind of get hooked onto that ability to make things happen. So I lasted for about a year outside of startups. And then I got bored, and I called Alex, who's a friend of mine from high school, and I said, hey, are you thinking about doing something? And he had kind of exited another situation from before, and I called a couple of other folks. So Virtualscopics had been good to us, and that was a spin out of the University of Rochester technology from there. So we literally went back to the tech transfer office at the U of R and said, hey, do you guys have interesting things? There's a few things that we had heard about before in the cardiovascular space. That technology was still available, and then got a set of folks together, asked some of my friends, some of Alex's friends, to put some money in, got a couple of the VCs involved, and that's how iCardiac was born. But again, that was a medical center, so not Flower Institute, but the cardiovascular group at the University of Rochester Medical Center, and also folks from the engineering department. Then combined with some really good folks from local companies who'd been at Kodak and a variety of different other places, and hired a lot of people from RIT too.
Another wonderful company for
Yeah,
Rochester.
Alex is doing a good job. I've passed the baton over 3 years, so I think since we passed the baton, the company's grown 3-4-fold. So I should have probably passed the baton a lot longer ago.
I'm sure there are many of us who would take the baton.
Well, that was actually, I have to admit, it's the other thing in entrepreneurship. You've got to. Over time, you realize what you're good at and what you're not necessarily quite as good at. So you have to kind of be, both in hiring as well as for yourself, you have to be very honest on, what are those things I should be doing? What should other people be doing? and then also realize that, okay, well, somebody who may have been good at doing X may not scale to the position once the group is, instead of 5 people, it's 50 people or 200 people. So you have to stay a little bit more flexible and agile. And I think with iCardiac, the passing the baton to Alex was probably one of the best decisions that we made. It was a little scary, but I trusted him, and it's worked out beautifully well.
And here you are, now you have Clerio, which was also from the University of Rochester. And we're going to talk a little bit about, you're out in Silicon Valley. Why didn't you pick a company from out there?
It's a good question, and actually I learned this stuff by, I wasn't intending to come back to Rochester full time. So really with Virtualscopics, I was like, hey, I'll do this for 6 months and then I'll head back, because allegedly all opportunity exists in Silicon Valley, which is very much of a myth. It's a different type of opportunity. So if I were to think about like what are the things that make Rochester very unique, and very unique for me, a much better place than being in Silicon Valley. And there's folks, I was back there recently, some of the folks I ran into, they're like, hey, why don't you come back? Can you do this, that, the other thing? And I said, I'll have problems, but there'll be different types of problems in Silicon Valley. So money may be easier, but recruiting is incredibly hard. The thing that my friends complain about on a consistent basis is they have to rebuild their teams every 6 to 12 months. So you may have a startup and you've recruited like an engineer and a chief technology officer and somebody else, and literally within like 3 or 4 months, one guy is at Google, the other one guy is at Facebook, your team is back down to close to zero, and there's no way you can match the offers that those companies are making. So we had dinner last night with another guy who spends a lot of time in Silicon Valley, and he said, on average, a good engineer on your team, if it's a Silicon Valley team, will be entertaining 4 to 5 offers, on average. And that's an engineer who is not looking for a job. So you're having to resell your team every single day on why they should come back to the office tomorrow. Which is, that makes it really hard to manage product, to focus on product. It's very expensive to build a team. You're constantly shuffling through new folks. And
That
a lot of
turnover is terrible.
technology is hard. Like the first stab you take at it, it doesn't always work, and then you got to take another stab at it. But generally, if a team is cohesive, sticks together, and continues to push through, eventually you'll succeed. But if you're losing your team every 6 to 12 months, it's incredibly hard to do that, and that's why it's so expensive to build startups there. So one is like recruiting and technical talent is as good here as anywhere in the world. The people are a lot more loyal. They're willing to stick with you as long as you take good care of them and treat them well. Cost of office space, infrastructure is much more reasonable for your team members. Cost of housing is a lot more reasonable. So now I look at those, and then access to technology, especially if you're looking at doing something out of academic institutions. U of R spends, I do a startup, and I kind of joke about it, I do a startup out of the U of R every 7 years, roughly. During that time period, they spend about $300 million on basic research. That's about $2.1 billion. Now, there are much more startups that can be done out of the U of R, and they are getting done. But there's other academic institutions similar to U of R who have kind of a really large kind of plethora of unique technologies, and that's kind of what I've made my focus. So I love being here, and it's cheap to live here. You can actually save some money.
Well, compared to Silicon Valley,
Oh,
yes.
it's crazy. A starter home, I was in Menlo Park over the weekend, and a starter home is like $3.5 million. And
it's not a mansion.
And it's not a it's 3.5 million. It's kind of a ranch. It's a nice home, but it's not like a mansion or has a swimming pool or any of the amenities. And those are the kind of places that your staff has to have. So then you have to figure out, okay, what do I have to pay my staff members to be able to afford a $3.5 million home? So next thing you realize, you kind of understand like why the companies in Silicon Valley have to do these 20, 30, $40 million rounds when an engineer for a year may cost you $250,000 without benefits.
Right. So you're saying you really get the pick of the crop here.
You have.
Want
No,
to invest.
you do have to. Yeah. No, you do have to obviously have a good technology. But if you've got a good technology, you've got access to some amazing people, and a lot of the folks at the U of R are truly as good as anybody in the world. So on our team at Clerio, Wayne Knox is focused on the laser stuff. He's probably one of the top 3 laser physicists on the kind of lasers that we're working on. Scott McRae is our refractive surgeon. He sits on the FDA advisory board for approving these products. So, and he's done, I think it's like 20,000 LASIK procedures, knows everybody in the industry. So you have access to those kinds of folks. And because there's not like, a million startups here, so somebody like Wayne and Scott isn't at the same time working with 6 or 7 startups. So you get a lot more focused attention from the academic thought leaders in a place like Rochester. I mean, eventually, there'll be more startups here and it'll be harder, but in the interim, it's okay.
So everybody go out there and start a startup.
Exactly.
And how do you know what to pick?
We've kind of reversed engineered the process now partially because of kind of what we learned with Virtualscopics and then what Alex and I learned with Linnell and other places. So we try to make sure that whatever we decide to build before we start it is fundable and the customers will buy the product. So we'll look at different technologies when we get started, and then when we find something that's super interesting, we go to folks, not asking them for money, but we go to VCs and say, hey, I'm not asking you to fund this, but could you give me some input on if this is even remotely a decent idea, and have them pressure test it? Because you don't want to go, at least in my opinion, because I'm lazy, I don't want to go too far in terms of building a startup and then finding out that nobody's going to fund it. So, if you know somebody, and VCs are much more willing to take these meetings, but you have to be very honest in these meetings. Like, even if the VC gets excited, you promise them you're not going to ask for money. You've got to kind of hold it. Maybe it's a follow-up phone call, but you say, like, I'm literally looking for advice on if this thing, in theory, could be fundable by somebody in the VC industry. And you try to do the same thing with customers. You kind of go, and that's what we did with Clerio. We went to, first we didn't go to the VCs that would finance the Series A and the B, because that's not necessarily a lot of money, but these projects can require a tremendous amount of money, so it could be as much as 30 to 60 million. So we said, okay, Scott McRae, you consult to some of these VCs. So I actually didn't know the VCs in the ophthalmic space, but
Right.
I figured out somebody who did, and we went to them through a set of introductions and said, hey, if we were to build a product in this space and we got it this far, and then we need it, and it was working at that point, and we need another 30 million, do you think somebody in the VC community would have any interest in it? So the folks said, yeah, if you get it to this point, it meets an unmet need. Nobody else is working on that kind of stuff. It's got good pedigree. You would need to make sure you meet these milestones, but if you do, somebody like us would very seriously consider writing a check for 30 million for it.
Oh.
So then we went to kind of the
kind of get the buzz going.
Get the buzz going. And then we went to customers and said, hey, this product's still probably 4 to 6 years from market, but if we were going to build this kind of a laser and it looked kind of like this and it did these things, would you ever conceive buying it, and why yes, why not? I'm not trying to sell you. It's not going to be ready for a while. And then we got feedback from them. I say, yeah, this would actually meet a lot of needs and this and that. So that also helped us kind of think of how do we build a business plan. We said, okay, if we were kind of going to build something like this, the customers would buy it, and there were enough folks in that list who would say, if you build it, yeah, I'd probably buy a system for 400,000 or 500,000 in that. And then if we got it halfway done, the VCs said, yeah, if you've got good human data and good animal data and seems to be working, and we know the refractive guys would be interested in buying, we'd probably put in 30, 50 million. Then we went kind of a couple of steps earlier and said, okay, let's go and talk to the Series A and Series B guys who'd need to put in, maybe 5 to, 2 to 10 million, and say, okay, well, these guys will eventually buy the product. If we get it halfway through clinical trials, these guys are going to give the next 30 to 50 million. Would you, ever conceive of, or somebody like you, putting in the first 2 to 5 million? So we kind of said, like, start with the end in mind, which is a bunch of folks buying it, see if you can validate it, and then see if you can back into it. And then also we said, hey, if the VCs, if there's some kind of financial calamity and the VCs can't finance it, we talked to a bunch of corporates, like folks in business development groups at some of the large ophthalmic companies, and said, hey, if we got it this far and we didn't want to take VC money for that last 30 to 50 million, would you be interested in potentially taking the product all the way to commercialization? So in some ways, there's still a lot of risk with the project. It's biotech or medical devices, but we've tried to de-risk as much the chain of activities that need to happen, that as long as everybody in the chain does their little piece, it goes to the next one, and then eventually, hopefully, somebody buys it for $1 billion, Should be nice.
You heard it here first. Now, even though you love Rochester, you still are a bi-coastal company.
Yeah.
And you're a bi-coastal guy.
Yeah.
How does that work? You have about 50 employees, right, with contractors and full-time and your
It's
advisory?
actually, I don't think we could have ever done it with Virtualscopics because there was no Skype, join me, video conferencing, cell phone minutes were expensive. We started doing a lot more, what I would say, geographically diversified with iCardiac. So there's a large within Jamie's group over there. There's a large group in technology folks in Vietnam, which has worked out really well. We've got with iCardiac, there's a group of radiologists out in Poland. So we got a lot more comfortable with, hey, you can run an organization that's fairly geographically dispersed, but you need to check in with folks and make sure everybody's happy, and you got to make sure everybody's got the technology to do that. So part of the reason that on the company side that we decided to kind of be geographically broad is some of the folks were absolutely the best in the world in terms of designing LASIK equipment of previous generation. A lot of those startups occurred on the West Coast. The guy who founded Visex, he's an inventor of LASIK, he's a senior advisor to us. He's on the West Coast. The guy who architected those early systems, Dan Summers, is on the West Coast. The guy who did a lot of the next generation of the flap cutters, Bob Heitel, he's on the West Coast. They all, made really good money on the last time around, but they're also addicted to entrepreneurship, and their companies got very large global multinationals. They were kind of looking to do the next interesting thing, and we said, hey, let's try to see if we can initially work on a remote basis. So we got them as contractors, worked out really well, and then we've been transitioning folks like them to full-time. Obviously, we have to do a lot of project coordination out of Rochester, but that's worked out well. And I spend a good chunk of my time out there too, and it's good to, especially the downstream, there's some VCs out here, but there's not a lot of VCs in town who can write a check for $50 million. A lot of those guys are in Boston, New York, and San Francisco. So I'm continuing to cultivate those relationships. Hey, we moved 1/3 of the way. Now we need to move another part of the way. Are you still interested in writing that?
You got to
keep on. Just because
courting them.
Yeah, just because they said yes once doesn't mean that you can't have to continue to go back to them every 3 or 6 months.
And in Canada, you're working with too.
Yeah, actually, we got really lucky with Canada. So J&J, for anybody who's thinking about doing medical device stuff, Toronto's close by. It's only about 3 hours. Johnson & Johnson, which is one of the largest medical technology companies in the world, has actually an incubator. They are willing to take folks that are not permanently situated in Toronto. So they help us with some of the clinical trial design, and they've also been extremely helpful in terms of navigating the organization internally. And then our first in human studies we're planning to do in Canada.
Wow.
So we've got office stuff there. So the other thing that we've learned is there's no amount of help that's too small for a startup. So even though we've raised about 14 million so far, we will, if there's a grant that pays for like 10% of something, we'll go after it. If there's something that pays for like sales tax abatement on a PC for $300, we'll go for it. And we've kind of did a rough tally that all of these things that we've done in the last 3 years, and there's probably, 50, 60 of these programs that we participated in, it's done almost dollar for dollar matching for the venture amount. So we've spent about, 4 or 5 million in venture money, and about an equivalent amount of money has been spent by other folks who are looking to try to spur entrepreneurship, which is also a thing that you do not get in California. There are no organizations who will do dollar for dollar matching on programs, whether it's High Tech Rochester, Comida, some of the CEIS programs out of the U of R, et cetera. So there's a lot of, you got to fill out the paperwork, you got to be a corporate citizen, you got to generate jobs, because if you can't put jobs on that spreadsheet that you send back to them. Yeah. But if you're doing a good job, you're going to generate jobs. So you should be. I think it makes sense to take advantage of those.
So take advantage of those resources. Yep. Mike, thank you so much. We're so glad you're here. And we're going to take some questions from the audience.
Thank you.